Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to shift across and delve into the world of Amazon, going to the world of Amazon, in fact. And in fact, we're going to look at mechanisms in digital innovation. The gentleman that's going to share with you on stage right now all about that is actually going to discuss how Amazon's leadership principle-driven culture supports customer obsession, digital transformation, and innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Sales and Operations Country Leader of Amazon Web Services Germany, Mr. Jeff Brown.
Thanks, Peter.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Jeff Brown. As Peter said, I run sales and operations for AWS, or Amazon's cloud computing business in Germany. And I was asked to come in and talk about the category of de-economy. And interestingly, I decided to kind of take this from more of an Amazon philosophical view, because I think it's actually quite important that companies recognize that the culture change that takes place inside a company is equally challenging as compared to just the technology change that's happening right now. And so what I'm going to do is go through and share a little bit about Amazon's culture, and a little bit about what Jeff Bezos talked about 20 years ago, which has kind of allowed us to operate in this perpetual form of digital transformation. I'm going to try to tie the last 20 years together in under 30 minutes. But I think it's really important to recognize that the messages that Jeff Bezos said 20 years ago have really allowed the company to operate in this constant mode of digital innovation. So let's go in. What is innovation at Amazon? I think everyone knows that the company culture is to constantly invent, invest, etc. But it's funny when you start thinking about the de-economy. I started to think, well, are we talking about drones? Well, we do that. Are we talking about digital services? Some of you may know we just launched a brand new show called You Are Wanted, which with Matthias Schweighöfer. Yeah, thank you. And my understanding is that this is quite an accomplishment because it's the first time we've ever launched a television show worldwide that is German-based. Clearly, you understand that we're in the devices business, whether it be Kindle or our Fire TV, tablets, etc. We're clearly in the delivery business, so we got a lot of D's going on here. And then for those of you that don't know, we just launched a brand new shopping experience in Seattle, which is incredibly cool. You can imagine walking into a store that doesn't have any employees. You walk in, you scan, you come in, you pick out your item, and through a combination of machine learning, computer vision, etc., you walk in, take what you want, and you leave. This was just an idea that was crafted 4 years ago, and now it's come to reality. Now, I'm pretty proud of the cloud business that we represent, but we won't go into that too much today. And then clearly, we've got a robotics business that runs our distribution centers and such. So it kind of gives you a sense of the fact that the company likes to invent. It's within the culture. So let's go in and talk about, well, why is that good for customers? So one of the things you're going to see today is the harmony between when one of our inventions and a customer's desire to invent and our technology kind of tends to kind of blur and come together. Alexa is a perfect example. Although I didn't talk about it as one of the devices, it's a perfect example of a device that is now estimated to be an incredibly large business for Amazon. And the example here about Capital One is a perfect one. So now you can be a Capital One customer and just ask Alexa, what is my balance? I'd like to pay a bill, etc. And there was kind of a milestone that happened with Alexa last week, which is we now have over 10,000 skills that customers have built for Alexa. So now you're getting in an ecosystem of voice control that becomes an entire new paradigm. So, this is an example of something that was, again, just an idea that was created within Amazon and then implemented because of the fact that there happens to be great technology. So, I showed my wife this slide last night, and she kind of looked at me like, I have no idea what that means. But let me try to explain it to you and kind of show you how the principles that Jeff Bezos made when he created the company have allowed us to operate. So basically what I want to talk about is innovation is equal to the organization itself, and the organization is a combination of what we call cultural leadership principles as well as mechanisms that allow those leadership principles to operate in an effective way. Without mechanisms, you really aren't going to be able to get very far. So I'm going to talk about those today, but then it's also the multiplication of technology. You have to have the right architectures to be able to implement these ideas, and we'll talk about that at the end. The one thing that I would say is this is just how Amazon operates. This doesn't necessarily, this isn't a recommendation for how you operate. If you have better ideas, better leadership principles, different mechanisms, I'm all ears. But this is just some examples of some of the things that I've seen, because I've been with AWS now for 4 years. I spent my first 3 years helping customers transition to cloud technologies in California, and then I spent the last year in Germany. And the great part about it is it's completely globally consistent. What's happening here is what happened in the US maybe a year ago. So you're starting to see kind of this global transition to these new architectures, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what a lot of people don't understand, and I think this is really one of the most fascinating things about this company, is that in 1997, Jeff Bezos wrote a letter to shareholders that basically outlined how the company was going to operate. And I'll have to tell you that if you do not have a copy of this, you'll see my email address at the end. I'm happy to send you a copy. This is one of the greatest letters he could have ever written because it basically allowed the framework of how the company was going to operate. And I'm going to go through what he says in this letter as a mechanism that might help you think about going through digital transformation in your own company. So the first of all is that he talks about that this is day one for the internet. Clearly, in anything digital these days, the internet is involved. But it's fascinating that it's day one for our customers, it's day one for invention, it's day one for this kind of relentless focus on innovation. And it's actually, if you saw any Amazon badge, you'd actually see on the back, it actually says, this is day one. So I want to kind of dive into a little bit more into this letter. Because what you're going to find are some pretty interesting themes that now kind of guide all the employees and everything we do at the company. So the first is we have leadership principles. Can I just quickly, show of hands, has anybody heard of the Amazon leadership principles before? Okay. So there's 14 of them. They're basically the guiding principles on the way the company operates. It's how we hire employees. It's how we measure each other. You can't go a day at Amazon without mentioning one of the leadership principles. And back in 1997, the shareholder letter effectively said that there were 6. They're the ones in orange. That the company, these were the principles that the company was going to live by. The rest have been added over the last 20 years, but it is important that those 6 still remain. And we're going to dive into those and kind of explain how they lead us to innovate. They do change, by the way. So, for example, if you look under the one called Earns Trust, about a year and a half ago, we had a leadership principle called vocally self-critical. This was the ability that you could admit that you're wrong. You could admit that you have places to grow. You could admit that you might not know everything. You might have made a mistake. If you've ever been through an Amazon interview, I wouldn't be surprised if someone were to ask you, tell me the last time that you failed. Tell me the last time that you didn't meet a customer's expectations. These are the types of things that we look for, and this is kind of how the leadership principles, help us evolve. So I'm going to go into really the first one, and this is the most important. So you maybe have heard that Jeff Bezos talks about the fact that we want to be the Earth's most customer-centric company. That was his line from the beginning of the starting of the company, and he means it. This is the first leadership principle. It is full stop, the most important, no matter what. And we're going to talk about why customer obsession is important when you're thinking about innovation. Because I've watched companies in California, in Germany, that are attempting to innovate, but they may not necessarily be starting with the customer. So we're going to talk about that right now. So in the letter, he talks about the fact that we're going to offer our customers this compelling value, that we're grateful for the trust that customers have given us, that we're going to build something that matters to customers. And again, if you have the letter, you can kind of go through, there's a lot of other references to customers. But how does that translate into how the company operates today? So let me go through the leadership principle first, and then I'm going to go through the mechanism that supports it. So the first is, this is the actual leadership principle that we all live by. Leaders start with the customer and work backwards. Incredibly important philosophy I'll talk to you in a second about. We work to earn and keep the trust of customers, but we pay attention to competitors, but we obsess over customers. There's a big difference. If you look at companies right now that are trying to reinvent themselves, maybe go through this digital transformation, if they're spending too much time focusing on their competitors, they're probably not starting in the right spot. So how does this translate? Well, I'll tell you a quick little story. So I interview hundreds of people a year. Generally, they're account managers and solution architects from technology companies around Germany. And as I said before, we have questions that we like to ask, because if you don't hire people that are customer obsessed, how are you going to roll out a customer obsessed culture? So one of the questions that we like to ask is, like I said, tell me the last time you failed in the eyes of your customer, or tell me the last great thing that you did for a customer, you exceeded a customer's expectation, etc. And you immediately find that people answer one of two ways. They immediately start thinking about their customer in terms of the great things that they've done for them, or they go the opposite direction. They talk about all the things that their customer's done for them. Oh, I signed a contract at the end of last year, so on and so forth. It's all about the money. At that point, we immediately diverge. That is not someone that Amazon's going to hire. We're not going to be a group of salespeople that, for instance, just show up at the end of the year to renew a contract. It's just not part of the culture. So you think about hiring people that are customer obsessed and that can really empathize with the customer. So now we're going to talk about the mechanism that allows customer obsession to drive innovation. Every single business at Amazon uses a process called the press release FAQ. Okay, this is a one page. You can kind of read a little bit about it. Before we do anything, write a line of code, invest any dollars, etc. The owner of the press release, which could be anyone in the company, writes a one-page narrative about what they want to build and how customer-centric. What is it going to do to help the customer? You kind of, like I said, leap into the future. You imagine how the customer is going to feel, what it's going to accomplish for them. What are they going to say when it launches? What is it not going to do? And you go through this fairly detailed process that gets iterated on by your peers and your management and things like that. And at the end of it, you get a really good sense that anyone could pick this document up and understand what it is you're trying to build. From there, at Amazon, frequently, the person that wrote the PR FAQ is actually hired to go run that business. They go create the business. And if it's a big enough idea, then it gets funded and it could end up being something quite large. What a lot of people don't know is that Amazon Web Services started 11 years ago. It was started through a narrative that was written by an employee based in South Africa, where he believed that we could start operating web services to companies kind of on an on-demand basis. And that was such a big idea, but it was so misunderstood back then that he had to write this document. It ultimately turned into a 6-page paper, of which it then ultimately got to my boss, our CEO, and Jeff Bezos, and it was funded. But it gives you a sense of, if you don't start with the press release, if you don't start with the customer and work backwards, the chances of the innovation being effective by the time you actually get to the point of launching is very low. So what are the questions that we ask in the PR FAQ? The first thing is, who is the customer? What's the problem? What's the opportunity, et cetera? And like I said, if you'd like more information about this, we're happy to share it. What we do at AWS today is typically work in consultation with customers to go through this process so that they can really get to a granular level about what it is they're trying to build and how it's going to impact their customers or their partners or what have you. So, an example of something that used the PR FAQ process. How many people have ever heard of the dash button? Okay, this is a brand new invention that just came out not too long ago. This was introduced from narrative, from PR FAQ, to launch in 56 days. We're to the point now where it's almost endless, the possibilities. Sure, you can replenish toilet paper or laundry detergent or what have you, but people are doing amazing things. I know of proof of concepts that are happening with the dash button that are changing the way German companies are operating with their customer base. And so, you think about something that's a simple idea, just a Wi-Fi connected IoT device, you then blend it in with a worldwide IoT platform, you start thinking about the problem that you're going to solve for your customer, comes into a pretty amazing flywheel effect. And for those of you that aren't familiar with a flywheel, it's kind of a primary mechanism that's at or Amazon, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So, where I think this is really cool, you can go online and you can see people that are using it to, open their garage door and pull out their Tesla. And there's all kinds of really cool things that are happening. But just, pay attention to the dash button because it's going to be pretty effective. So the next major theme in the shareholder letter that, again, if this were not in there, I really don't think Amazon could operate the way that it does. It's the theory that you need to think long term and you have to have owners or ownership. So there's a couple different things that I want to talk about. So Jeff Bezos tells a story about how he had a rental house in Seattle, and he hadn't heard from the renters for a while. He got a phone call from the neighbors. Neighbors said, "You better come by. I think you'd better check out your house." When he came into the house, he found the Christmas tree spiked into the floor of the kitchen, okay? And they had left. They didn't pay their bill. They were obviously bad renters. But it really sent a signal to him that some people mentally are renters and some people are owners. And there's a really big difference. Owners think long term. Owners would never pound a Christmas tree into the floor of the kitchen. So when he started thinking about ownership, it became one of the original leadership principles. Now, fast forward probably about 7 or 8 years, and I'll talk about DevOps in a second. The convergence of DevOps, which is highly dependent on ownership, and the leadership principle of ownership kind of changed the company, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in the shareholder letter, what does he talk about when he means ownership and long term? So the belief that you're constantly going to be investing and you're always going to be thinking about the long term. One thing that companies do today is they think in 3-year increments. There's a philosophy that Amazon has that if you can think in 7-year increments, 7-year futures, that you will have very few competitors because there are very few companies that will ever think longer than 3 years out. So you take that idea, you immediately go public, you tell your investors. There's an interesting line in here. We will continue to make investment decisions in light of long-term market leadership rather than short-term profitability considerations. For the last 20 years, every time we release earnings, someone says something about that line because the belief is we're always going to be reinvesting. We're always going to be looking at new ideas. Without that expectation, you really don't have much of a chance because your shareholders are going to be thinking of you more as a renter than an owner. So hopefully that makes sense. So the other thing to keep in mind is how does this part of the shareholder letter translate into the way the company operates and how the employees operate? So there's 3 leadership principles that I want to bring up very quickly. The first is that owners, they think long term. They look for bold ways to serve customers. And think big is something that came later down the road, but it's part of the way that we think about making big, bold investments. And then the last is we're misunderstood for long periods of time. We have no problem inventing something that may take a while for the market to actually realize what it is. I'm not going to go into these too much more deeply, but I wanted to make sure that you saw these are also things. We use these every single day. So let's talk about investing, experimenting, and failing. This is core to the company. And if you're going through any kind of digital transformation, more than likely, this has to exist in your company or you're going to struggle. And if there's one thing I hear from companies, it's that the employees have not been given the right to fail. They've not been given the right to experiment. Some people kind of translate that into risk. So let's talk about this a little bit. So 2006, company announces that we're going to create this risky bet, and we're going to basically start offering web services to customers. 11 years later, business is a $14 billion business. It grows 47% annually, and it's estimated that it could be larger than Amazon.com. Perfect example of a company that, of an opportunity that was ultimately written by an employee and then taken public. But keep in mind, not everything works, and not everything is going to work like AWS. So just last year, in the latest shareholder letter, he talked about the fact that I believe that one area where we are especially distinctive is failure. I believe we are the best place in the world to fail. Every employee knows this, they feel this, they're allowed to understand this. This is key. So this last line is kind of interesting. Failure and invention are inseparable twins. So you can have ownership, you can have long-term thinking, you can think big, you can be customer obsessed and work backward from the customer, but if you're not allowed to experiment and fail, it's not really worth it, right? That's why kind of all these things have to be happening at the same time. So how many people remember the fact that we announced a phone? The Amazon Fire phone. Tremendously successful, right? No. And what was really great about this is that Jeff came out in public and basically said, if you think that's a big failure, we're working on some much bigger failures, and I'm not kidding. They are going to make the Fire phone look like a tiny blip. And he's serious, because he set that expectation back in 1997 that we were going to invest, and there were going to be failures. So, it's kind of interesting that you have to be able to set that. So the last piece, or the last ingredient that I want to make sure that I touch on is architecture and technology. Now, while this was not in the 1997 letter, it's something that's happened over the last, say, 15 years. So I'm going to try to speed up here because I'm going to run out of time. In 2001, many people don't know that Amazon.com was one monolithic application, and it was on the verge of failing. So what happened there was kind of a convergence of a little bit of luck, a lot of hard work, but basically they ended up sort of taking the application apart. You started to see that this wasn't going to work for Amazon long term. So fast forward into 2005 or so, you now had basically a service-oriented architecture. At that time, it was 14,000 different microservices, all API connected. And this is, again, prior to AWS. And what happened was we were starting to recognize how to operate the company through very small teams. So what we do is we call those two pizza teams, which means these are teams that are 8 to 10 employees. They have ownership. They build and they own. They build and then they launch what they own. There is no handing it over to IT, et cetera. That allows you to have this kind of iteration and kind of fast-moving development. What a lot of people don't understand is that this was kind of our internal version of DevOps. Without this kind of change into microservices and a heavily reliance on the leadership principles of ownership, think big, and bias for action, we wouldn't have been able to have our software development teams move into this kind of two-pizza team model where today they implement a new change to the 600 Amazon websites every 1.5 seconds. So you think about the iteration that's happening right now at scale around the globe, which obviously runs on AWS, is pretty massive. And this was through our own kind of internal learnings. So let's talk about how we finish here. So the secrets of D-success, right? How are you going to digitally transform? How are you going to create disruption, enter new markets, allow your employees to do big things? My recommendation is, 1, work backwards from customers. 2, you have to have some long-term thinking. If you're only thinking about your next stock release 90 days out, you're probably not going to be allowed to fail. Obviously, the next one, experimentation and failure, and then ownership of your software developers. So what's missing? So this is my boss. This is the CEO of AWS. And I couldn't really sum this up without without just kind of reading what he says. Innovation requires 2 things: the ability to try a lot of experiments and not having to live with the collateral damage of the failed experiments. And that's where AWS comes in. So, you will have a choice. If you can fix your culture, if you can live by principles that allow your employees to operate in this kind of fast-paced model, you have the choice now to go out and pick a provider. Pick whatever provider you think is going to give you the best opportunity, but you have to have a global technology platform that allows it to get smarter, that allows your company to start to operate and do things just because of the fact that it does improve itself every single day. At AWS, last year we had over 1,000 new features and capabilities that were added into the platform. So the message that I'm basically trying to say is, if you can think about allowing that culture to take place, but then also give your employees the technology where you don't have to live with the collateral damage of experimentation, then your chances are you're going to be incredibly successful. So let me stop here. We have about 3 minutes. Is there a microphone that we could take some questions? Can I answer any questions before we just finish up? No? Okay. So anyway, I want to thank you. It's an exhilarating place to work, and one of the things that we really do get excited about is building on our technology and then providing it back to our customer base. If you ever have any needs to talk about how your own company is transforming and you'd like any help, it's free of charge. We're happy to meet with you, and you might see our big cloud that is outside. But generally speaking, I would leave you with this one thought. If you're going to go through some kind of transformation for your customers, you have to also look at your employees. You have to give them all of that capability, and you have to have some kind of principle that they're going to live by. And really, you cannot do this. If you didn't have one of those ingredients that I mentioned, chances are your company may have some challenges in trying to disrupt itself. And so if we can provide any of the lessons that have been learned over the last 20 years, by all means, send me an email. We're happy to get engaged and kind of tell you what we've learned. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jeff Brown.